SMMR, also known as SUMMER, stands for Sustainable Urban Mobility in Metropolitan Regions in ASEAN. SUMMER is an ASEAN-German cooperation project with the objective to implement concepts and strategies for integrated and sustainable mobility across the 10 ASEAN member states. Since 2019, SUMMER is developing 4 knowledge products in the form of green papers and webinars, and this covers the following topics: SUMPs, Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans; MTEs, Metropolitan Transport Executives; Smart and Open, which refers to smart and open traffic management; and finally, HUBs, which refers to intermodal interchanges. Since 2019, SUMMER is also supporting 3 metropolitan regions established ready to implement pilot projects. These metropolitan regions include Phnom Penh in Cambodia, Can Tho in Vietnam, and the cross-border region between Vientiane Lao PDR and Nong Khai in Thailand. The SUMMER German Cooperation Project is implemented by GFA Consulting Group together with Clean Air Asia, the Wuppertal Institute, and Ruprecht Consult on behalf of GIZ and the ASEAN Secretariat. For more information, visit us at www.summer.asia or find us on LinkedIn and Facebook.
That this is the 4th and last webinar in our series on open data. Today we're going to be talking about how to make open data work. So today we will touch on the topic of how do we make open data work. And we have been discussing this in the previous sessions, of course, but now we want to zoom in on that. We will start today's session with an introduction to the SUMMER project, followed by a group photo. And then we will dive into learning about ensuring stakeholder engagement from Dr. John McCarthy, and who are these stakeholders and how do we bring them on board the shared goals of having open data, and what message do we need to highlight to open data platform providers. And then we'll have Mirko Goletz who'll show us use cases of how global data and open data are both being used to assess transport and thereby contribute to sustainable development goals, and its indicator of ensuring access to public transport and how they derive CO2 emissions of private motorized vehicles. And then speaking of indicators and also touching on the parameters, we will lastly have Cornie Huizenga to share with us the open data character of the Asian transport outlook that's being developed and how it uses secondary and primary data from a variety of sources, including publicly available big data. And each of these presenters will have 15 minutes to share, and at the end of all the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. John McCarthy, who's the global lead for the shared, connected, and autonomous vehicles activity within Arup, and leads the European Intelligent Mobility business. John was has recently been elected to the OECD's Working Group on Artificial Intelligence, and prior to Arup, he was head of discipline for intelligent mobility with Atkins Global, where he was responsible for creating a data-centric service that included early use of cloud computing, real-time modeling, data lake standardization, AI utilization, as well as machine learning and data interoperability. Dr. John McCarthy was a Transport for London's leading expert in smart cities, and he was responsible for delivering a wide range of data-enabled services, utilizing emerging technologies and practice. So you'll hear more from him about that. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to John. John, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and good morning, everybody. It's a real honor to be here to share some of the thoughts I have around open data. And I suppose a reflection for me is that we are using technology to connect across the globe right now. We're using data in its rawest form for people like myself in Ireland, people scattered across the globe to engage. And it highlights the importance of being able to access systems and utilize systems. And the service that we're utilizing teams today is based on the availability of data through the interfaces that we've established. So I think, it sets the precursor for what we'll talk about, or what I'll talk about during the next few slides in relation to the power of data and how open data can be used for the benefit of all, and considerations around how that can be put in place. So thank you very much, Kathleen. Good day to everyone. Many thanks for joining me as I present to you around open data and the importance of creating stakeholder engagement. Without stakeholders, you won't succeed in what you're trying to deliver with open data. So I'll go through a number of elements that have to be considered in this area. Who am I? I'm Dr. John McCarthy. I lead our intelligent mobility business within Europe for ARP being a global engineering consultancy firm. I'm also heavily involved in data activities across the physical and digital infrastructure domains, particularly as it relates to connected, shared and autonomous vehicles, which is an emerging area for consideration also. So bear with me over the course of the next 12 to 15 minutes as I outline some areas of consideration, but I'll start with the fundamentals. The fundamentals, relate to what is open data. And you hear the term an awful lot, and you've probably heard it quite a bit if you've listened to a number of lectures already in this area. But just to remind ourselves, to set the ground line, is that data, for it to be open, it has to be usable. You have to be able to access it and you have to be able to share it. And those are three simple tenets that have to be realized. And, you know, it's in the realization that the challenges arise, because accessibility, you know, what information are you pushing out there, or do you expect people to pull it from your site? And how do you make them aware that it is in existence? It is in the right formats that it can be used. And so there's lots of data, but what standards are being used for the storing of it, for the creation of the data? What governance is in place to allow that access to actually take place? And can you use it? And, you know, you must be able to turn it into something. You must be able to deliver a service ultimately from the accessibility of open data. So, but are you able to use what you're being given? And how can you share it? That push-pull dynamic. How can you create a mechanism, that platform, that allows you to share the data in a way that drives commercial activity and also efficiencies across private and public enterprises? So for me, that's what open data is all about. And why do we care about it? Which, you know, the flip side of that is, you know, why should we invest our time or money or resources to make open data reality? Well, it comes down to, you know, a number of simple but important threads, and I've mentioned them already. Is that, you know, you're going to increase your efficiencies and the quality of what you're delivering to the public, that, you know, who are our clients here. In terms of information, in terms of them being able to access services, in terms of them having an informed and trusted partner in the delivery of information. A huge aspect of it from a financial perspective then is on the cost savings. The European Union estimated as of 2020 this year that they've saved 1.8 billion euros already through the provision of open data. And that saving can be achieved through, you know, efficiencies brought into the services, identification of areas that need to be improved, stopping doing what isn't working, and also creating the access for opportunities to drive job creation externally. As I mentioned already, greater efficiencies. When we understand what data is in existence, we'll be able to identify how we can use it, what services we can create from it, and also from the other side around, once we know what services we want to deliver from a private sector perspective, identifying then the route back to the tap where the data is being turned on, and efficiencies that can be introduced there. And, you know, most importantly, by doing this, you're saving time, you're saving money, and you're creating jobs, you're creating new skill sets, and you're delivering sustainable environmental outcomes by not having inefficiencies in the overall system. So it's really important. Open data is really important. And, you know, there's ways and means to convert what work we do in open data to really key identifiable key performance indicators, which I'll touch on in a little. I've touched on this probably a bit already. It's in around, you know, the value, that return on investment, the direct value associated with it, which I've already mentioned on job creation, and the revenue that can be identified from the private sector, which creates new skills, which pushes money back into the economy, which pushes more requirements for open data to be pushed out there from other organizations. So that circular economy on the data side, very important here, linked into the indirect value associated with open data. So to make this a reality, it's important to land it so that people can relate to it, at a practical level. So Transport for London, one of the largest, I was going to say most important, but others might have a view that they're more important. But we'll say Transport for London, a significant organisation in the provision of services in a metropolis. I had the, very good fortune to work there for a number of years, leading the smart city developments and provision of traffic management services related to that. And touch upon that is the development of open data platform which was created within Transport for London. And the reason was that they, as an organisation, identified that they had a huge amount of data within their remit, that they had this data, and how can they create value, not just for themselves, but also for the city as a whole. And then from that discussion, what are the mechanisms to do that? And, engagement, a really strong piece that we'll cover in some slide or two. But from the economic benefits, from having done that, from having released your data, you have, 500 new jobs having been created from the release of data. In addition to that, you've over 230 indirect jobs in terms of the value chain, the supply chain. The figures presented here are huge, and the investment is quite small. So that ROI, that return on investment, is staggering when you look at London. And to talk through that, it didn't happen overnight. Significant stakeholder engagement, significant engagement internally and externally to get partners and services identified that would use the data. Look at that, in terms of a summary in the circle here, we start off at the top is the transport network provider, that is Transport for London. It makes its data available through APIs in standardized format for services that are already identified, and static files and feeds that can be linked to the services that are going to be created. Businesses, and a number are mentioned here, name checked here, but those and many others are using that data along with academic bodies to create services, or have already identified services, and they know that they need the data to help substantiate the demand that they have identified from the private sector, from the travelling public. So the data is coming from Transport for London, going out into the business through an open data platform in different formats, different standards. Everyone's clear how and why and when that was being done. And then Transport for London as a network is taking advantage of these in terms of the services to provide a better experience to the travelling public, which from a transport operator or transport provision or network authority is really important. And then closing the circle back is the insights, understanding the behavioral aspects of it and understanding the behaviors. That is, gold dust in the provision of a service. And that gold level service that TfL, provide by and large is driven by insight in terms of what the customer wants, what the customer needs, and how TfL are responding to that. So open data is a loop. It's a closed loop in terms of that it's from pushing out the data, identifying the data, what it has, pushing it out there, business creating value from it, sharing with the travelling public getting a better experience that TfL can measure in order to provide more data that will drive new services. So it's a cyclical event and a great testimony to the power and value that can be gained from the provision of open data. What's really important, though, is to create a common vision for the stakeholders involved, because it's not just one authority, it's not just one private body. Everyone needs that true north, that aspirational goal for which all activities will be underpinned by. And from a public body, I've tried to limit it. There's a number of points, but I've tried to limit some of the key points here. And for a public body is, that the data is accessible, and we've touched on that, I think, on one of the very first few slides, and driving engagement across all the institutes and private institutes, public bodies, academia, to make sure that they're aware that the data is there, that they will use the data, and then that they will feed that back as part of the overall supply chain. The engagement with the business sector is a critical part of all of this in terms of linking in with the sectors and the services that are going to be created or aspire to be created to make sure that you are providing the best value for their market development, and making businesses aware and providing the completely transparent and accessible way of utilizing these government data sets, because there's no point holding it in a silo or creating barriers either through technical or policy elements, even though the data might be open per se. From the research community, the skill sets that can be developed, we see a huge amount of pushing now in artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., data analysis, data science, all linked into the accessibility of data. And we touched on it on the previous slide, looking at that, creating those insights, which comes from the analysis of data. And citizens, we as individuals, driving the need for transparency around data and how it's shared, and then engaging with all the other parts of this chain, to identify and match our needs and vice versa. But it's really important that, open data, in terms of creating value and benefit from it, it's not about competition, it's about collaboration across the private, public and academic space. And open data depends on a number of elements that are identified here in blue. At a national level, creating the leadership and governance to allow open data become part of a fabric of how we live our lives. Public body leadership, that people take ownership within the public institutes for the establishment of open data and engage with their colleagues in a fair and firm way to make sure that happens. We have to make sure at a technical level, and I don't talk about the technology side of things a huge amount, even though I am a technologist. We might do that some other day. It is, what you give to the public or what you give to the private bodies to allow them to turn that into services has to be of a high quality. It has to be linked into a standard. And we have to establish the technical capability to do that. The platform, the open data platform, has to work. If it doesn't work, then you lose trust, you lose value, and then you lose reputation. You have a strong reputational impact. So the technical capability to push that data out has to be, absolutely perfect. And that outreach and engagement, we have to, as people involved in the conversation around open data, make sure that we can, engage with all the participants in the supply chain to make sure that they're aware of it, that they create value from it, and that they link into what our individual needs. And the more data, more business opportunities. But it's not about quality. It's not about quantity. Sorry, it's not about quantity. It's about the quality that's going to be created. And how you measure that, how you measure the impact is really important. And that relates to your KPIs, your key performance indicators, what looks good up on the top left, what might be bad down the top bottom right, and how you can move that around so you can come with a value for the traveling public from a transportation perspective, which is my bias. And links into 3 key elements for key performance indicators. The readiness. Is it actually open data? Have you really defined it, decided and signed off that open data is what you're providing? The implementation. Well, you have to be providing something that is going to provide value or create value. So your implementation of your data sets, have to be linked into the services. And the impact is probably on the top of the value chain here in terms of the conversation, because that's will define the services, or the services and the impact are linked on both sides of the coin, and that will drive kind of the requirements at a technical. As I said earlier, it's not in terms of the quantity of data, and finally I said it right this time, it's not in terms of the quantity of data that's being pushed out there, but it's in the needs of the user, you and I. Because we define what we want, and by defining and engaging, and the market in the private sector will, always react to what individuals and groups of people want to create new services, which will link back to their revenue opportunities. So it's not about the needs of the publisher who's pushing the data, it's about you and I, and about creating the link between the two, so that when we have more data, more opportunities, and more value derived. But the starting point is about enabling that innovation linked into our needs, and not just pushing data out there for the sake of it. Has to be aligned to the services. In terms of the potential pitfalls, and I suppose some of the learnings, that we try new so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past is, data should have no limitations, readily accessible at a technical level. The platform should operate. If it doesn't operate, people won't use it. If they don't use it, then how can they engage with the rest of the community to tell people that is a valuable resource that could be used? As I said, it has to be focused on the user, which my needs, your needs will drive what the community will respond to in terms of turning on the tap of data. At a technical level, the data has to be in the right standard, has to be formalized so that it can be used by the private sector. And that's not a huge activity, but that conversation has to take place. That stakeholder engagement has to happen. Look beyond your numbers, focus on the impacts, and we talked about that. Focus on the impacts and the demand that's out there, because the two are going to be related to each other. Open data from a licensing perspective, again, a small but important step to make sure complete transparency. The policies and procedures at a structural level, at an organizational level, have to be put in place. And that links into what I spoke about earlier in terms of that leadership for, value to be added through all of this activity to the release of open data. Has to be clear policies to how that's going to be put in place, and then the mechanisms for that to be put in place, and the who does what along that line. And the key performance indicators will need to be defined and explained, because that's how you can assess, impact you're making. I come from Ireland. My eyes, the greatest country in the world. People might have slightly different views. A relatively small country, actively engaged in the open data space, actively engaged across Europe in creating that environment for the sharing, exploitation, and the value creation through data. I think it's really important to start by starting this conversation. I hope it would lead to further conversations about the practical implementation of the governance structures that are needed, the technical elements to create the platform, identification of the services to be delivered. And that comes from engagement and stimulation and collaboration through all of this. So I hope you've enjoyed, or at least found some of what I've presented interesting. A lot there. Happy to expand that conversation at some stage if required. But as I say, an important learning is, engage the community, define the services to start off with, and then that will allow you to identify the technical elements, and the technical elements have to be fit for purpose and then have the skill sets. And I think then you're starting, you're at the first stage of, an exciting and really beneficial journey. Thank you very much for your time.
So giving us some more insights on the user or city level needs and services and the value of open data for different communities, we'd also like to hear from Mirko Goletz, who can share with us the use of global data alongside open data. Mirko is a trained economist based at the DLR Institute of Transport Research in Berlin, Germany. It's one of Europe's leading transport research institutes. He is currently acting head of the research group on automation and new mobility concepts. And his current research work focuses on the effects of digitalization on transport, as well as platform economics, new data gathering methods, and using open data for transport analysis on a global scale. You can find his research published in numerous scientific journals. So while we're loading your presentation, I'd like to give the floor to Mirko.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon to this round. Very, very happy to speak at this highly interesting webinar today. Kathleen, you almost highlighted everything that I'm doing right now, and I'm going to speak about the combination of open data and global remote sensing data to assess transport in cities, and show you the idea of combining such data and how they can generate added value to assess transport by showing you two examples. Let us start with the presentation. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Mirko Goletz. I'm from the Institute of Transport Research based at the DLR in Berlin, Germany. And I look very much forward to give you an overview about how we can use open and global data to assess transport in cities around the world. What I'm showing you today here is work that has been collaboratively carried out by our institute, the Institute of Transport Research, the German Remote Sensing Data Center, and the Institute of Remote Sensing Technology at DLR. So what is our motivation to use open and global data sets? Well, to understand our motivation, what we need to do is we need to have a look at the characteristics of these two data types. Open data, firstly, are data which anyone is free to use, reuse, or redistribute. So such data should be legally open. That means they should be publicly available, as well as technically open. That means available in a machine-readable format that is non-proprietary. A typical example for open data includes, for instance, OpenStreetMap or socioeconomic indicators that are published by JRC or the World Bank. It can also include satellite images from ESA and NASA, which are openly available. Global data, on the other hand, are data that cover the whole world. As such, they can be classified also as spatial data. Global data should be comparable on a global scale because they have been acquired using the same methodologies. And they can be open data, but they are not necessarily open data. A typical example here is Google here, Bing, for mapping services, but also OpenStreetMap, which I just mentioned before, which is an open data and also a global data set. But it can also be socioeconomic indicators such as population data. Gut, ich muss ja die Kamera wieder anmachen. Viertelstunde. GDP data, land use and buildings data, or also most remote sensing satellite images are globally available as per definition. In any case, it should be noted that open and global data can complement each other and they are not mutually exclusive. As an example for globally available open data sets, we see here results from the World Settlement Footprint 2015, which is a product that is maintained by DLR. The map shows settlement structures based on remote sensing satellite images. The images used come from Sentinel-1 and Landsat-8 satellites, who both have an open data policy. Besides the settlement footprint, the WSF also includes population data on a grid of 30 to 30 meters, settlement development dating back to the 1980s, and information about the impoverishness. Another advantage of such global remote sensing data is that they allow us to take a look back in time. What we see here is a map of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, showing the population of the year 1988. Again, data input here is open data coming from Landsat satellites. Here, we now see the same city, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, but data from the year 2012. We can clearly observe that the population has grown tremendously in the years since 1988, and that satellite images and remote sensing data can help us to monitor the advance of urbanization in a city. So what are examples of open and global data, and what can we do with them in the field of transportation? In my presentation, I will now give you an overview about the three different kinds of open and global data that we currently use to assess transport in cities at DLR. Firstly, we have a look at remote sensing data that we use to assess the population in cities and detect buildings. Secondly, OpenStreetMap that we use to extract street networks in cities. And thirdly, GTFS data that describe public transport in cities. Let us take a look on the potentials of using remote sensing data. Here, we see a map of the city of Santiago in Chile. In Santiago, we used aerial images to detect buildings using deep learning. In this case, a convolutional neural network was used. The input data we use here come from openly available and aerial images, which represents a good example for open data. In blue, we can see the buildings that to date are available in OpenStreetMap. As we can observe, there are still many gaps in these data. Now, if we apply our methodology of detecting buildings from aerial images using deep learning, we can see that this delivers an almost complete detection of buildings in the city of Santiago de Chile. Based on such detailed building information, we can apply algorithms to distribute the population in a city. Here, we see the distribution of the population in Santiago de Chile on a 100 by 100 meter grid. However, with our analysis, we can also go down to 30 to 30 meters with the World Settlement Footprint, or even distribute the population on a per building basis. I will show you an application later on, but we can clearly here observe that there are spots in the city like the central business district and the center that have a much higher population density, and the more we move to the suburban areas, the lesser the population density gets. Another source of input that we frequently use is OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap has the advantage of being open data, and hence it is freely available. It furthermore covers the whole world. However, data quality varies. OpenStreetMap contains many different information, for instance, on buildings, as we have seen for Santiago de Chile, elevation, land use, but also on the street network. From our experiences, the street network in OpenStreetMap has a good to very good quality, and it can be used to route persons or vehicles. For instance, we can route a person walking from point A to point B. Lastly, another source of input that we frequently use is OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap has the advantage of being open data, and hence it is freely available. It furthermore covers the whole world. However, data quality varies. OpenStreetMap contains many different information, for instance, on buildings, as we have seen for Santiago de Chile, elevation, land use, but also on the street network. From our experiences, the street network in OpenStreetMap has a good to very good quality, and it can be used to route persons or vehicles. For instance, we can route a person walking from point A to point B and calculate the time and distance this takes. Lastly, we frequently use data that follow the Google Transit Feed specification, abbreviated as GTFS. GTFS is a definition or standard of storing public transport information. Typically, one GTFS dataset covers the complete public transport system of a city. Because GTFS is a standard, it does not necessarily fall into the definition of open data, although many cities around the world make GTFS datasets openly available. The map that we see here provides a good example for an open data GTFS dataset. It comes from the Digital Matatu project and shows the public transport network of Nairobi in Kenya. Digital Matatu was a project in where the whole public transport network of Nairobi was mapped, thereby also including means of informal transport. And by the way, we all may have been in touch with GTFS data ourselves on our smartphones. If we use Google Maps to navigate with public transport, there are usually GTFS data behind. In the following, I would now like to show you two use cases that combine the above datasets. The first use case is the calculation of the Sustainable Development Goal Indicator SDG 11.2, which is maintained by UN Habitat. SDG 11.2 is an indicator that intends to measure the progress in achieving a safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport system for all. In its current version, it measures the share of the population that can access public transport. One important aspect of all SDGs is monitoring, meaning that continuous examination of the state of this indicator around the world is required. This means that the SDG 11.2 indicator should be calculated iteratively over time. This, of course, requires the availability of recent and comparable data. At DLR, we are currently working on calculating SDG 11.2 by using our knowledge and experience on global and open data through a common methodology. The definition of SDG 11.2 requires us to calculate the availability of public transport in a city within 500 meters of walking distance on a per-person basis. Therefore, we require the following input data to calculate SDG 11.2. Population information at best on a per building basis, a road network to route pedestrian trips, and the location of public transport stops. As you can already guess, all these input data can be derived from the sources that I presented you before. So how does this actually look like? Well, on the right side, we see a map of Santiago de Chile. The blue dots show the subway stations. In red, reddish and gray, we see houses. Colored houses lie within the 500 meters walking distance reach of public transport, while gray ones are too far away. That means they are above 500 meters walking distance. The map was created by applying the formula on the left side. As a result, we can see that SDG 11.2 accounts for about 95% of the total population of Santiago de Chile who have access to public transport within walking distance. We can furthermore also show the results of our analysis for the overall city, thereby identifying spots which may be underserved by public transport. Here again for Santiago, we map the population density against the population that lives in 500 meters walking distance. By doing such an analysis, we can also help cities to identify areas that may be underserved by the current public transport service, and we may even show them how they can advance in terms of achieving the goals of SDG 11.2. Another use case is the estimating of CO2 emissions of private motorized transport in urban areas worldwide. We do this by estimating the average kilometers per person per year using training data from 66 cities worldwide. Input data that we furthermore use include population information from the World Settlement Footprint, other open data such as information about GDP, public transit and traffic, and OpenStreetMap road networks. We then secondly generate model input parameters on topography, urban form, the public transport supply, here for instance the number of stops in a city or the share of kilometers per inhabitants on the transport infrastructure such as street connectivity and street type lengths, and we furthermore take into considerations SDG indicators such as 11.2 but also other SDG indicators. As a result, we get models that can help us to determine the person kilometers traveled in cities all around the world without actually doing a counting in these cities. Overall, we have an R-square of 0.6, but if we cluster this even further, we can see that for Europe, we can even go up to 0.8, which shows a high degree of confidentiality of our models. Finally, let me sum up my findings. Open and global data are of high value to assess transportation on a global scale, but also on a per city level. Even if we use global data, this does not mean that we cannot zoom in and generate findings that are relevant for a city. The advantage here is that such global data can be compared on a global scale, and that also means that the per city level results can be compared on a global scale. Furthermore, monitoring with remote sensing products is easier than monitoring data by doing countings and empirical analysis, which means maintaining updated data sets is relatively easy. In the future, we may even expect the increased availability of high-res remote sensing products, such as Landsat 8 and beyond. And lastly, I would like to state that cities that maintain open data portals and keep their data up to date are of great help for research and science, but they will also have a competitive advantage in the future as the assessment of their transport system requires data fusion, and this is eased by open data. Thank you very much for taking your time and listening to my presentation. I'm happy to keep in touch with you via email. You can see my address on the lower left, and I'm also available in the Q&A session in this webinar.
So last but not the least, I'd like to introduce Cornie Huizenga, who will zoom in on Asia. Cornie is an expert on sustainable low carbon transport and is representing the Asian Development Bank today. He served as the first Secretary General of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, or SLOCAT, the largest multi-stakeholder partnership on sustainable low carbon transport in developing countries. He's also been instrumental in raising the profile of transport in the UNFCCC, as well as the process around the SDGs. Prior to his involvement with SLOCAT, he had a lead role in establishing Clean Air Asia, which I'm part of, and where he also served as its first executive director. Cornie will do a live presentation and will tell us about the Asian Transport Outlook that's being developed by ADB. And so without further ado, Cornie, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you for including this profile picture there on the title slide, because actually the tie that I'm wearing is actually an open data source, which used to belong to Lee Schipper. And for those people on the call who remember Lee Schipper, who was actually, let's say, the pioneer on transport data and to some extent also on open data. I think that Konrad is operating the slides. Konrad, can you go to the first slide, please? And while we're doing that, maybe I was announced or introduced as a consultant of the Asian Development Bank. We're actually doing this project on behalf of the Asian Development Bank through the SLOCAT partnership. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Asian Development Bank, the ADB is the largest regional multilateral development bank in Asia. ADB on an annual basis is doing about 40 transport projects, and these transport projects are roughly together about $7 billion. About 20% of the projects that ADB is doing are projects on urban transport, and the urban transport projects can include anything ranging from supporting the construction of a subway, like in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh City, or also like the strengthening of walking infrastructure, which is the EDSA Greenway project in Metro Manila. Can we go to the next slide, Konrad? Okay, so the Asian Transport Outlook. What is the history of the Asian Transport Outlook? The history is actually that the ADB says if we want to be effective in providing assistance to the transport sector, we need to know what is happening in the transport sector. And I think that in the past, there have been various projects in the past in order to build up this knowledge, but they said, like, can we make a more definite effort? And in a way, it's interesting, like when the ADB started the thinking about the Asian Transport Outlook, they actually did not have this idea of an open data platform in mind. But as you will hear from the presentation, is that the way that we are developing the ATO is very much as an open data platform. I understand that Sudhir Gota is also listening in to this presentation, and the work that we have been doing on the development of the ATO has been done very much in collaboration with Sudhir. So the formal definition of the ATO is to strengthen the knowledge base on transport in the Asia-Pacific region in a manner that emphasizes and helps to create an institutionalized process for data and information collection, analysis, and documentation. And listening to the presentations this morning, I realized that we actually need to make it a little bit longer, and we need to include a reference to open data as well. Initially, the ATO was primarily developed for the ADB, and I think it was John who was saying, like, you need to look at your users. You need to see what your users want, and so on that basis, we have been starting to develop the structure of the ATO, and more on that later. However, if you are developing such a comprehensive knowledge base on transport, then it's clear that you can do a lot of other things with it as well. And I think that people have been talking about policy development and policy delivery. It is clear that in comparison to some of the previous presentations, especially the one by John, is that the Asian Transport Outlook is more operating up to now at the national and the regional and the global level than at the level of the individual cities. But we are aware that there is this need as well for data at the city level, and I will say something about that later as well. I very much like the presentation by Mirko, where he was speaking about how do you measure actually access to urban transport within the cities, because I think that in the metropolitan regions for the summer project, that this will be a key question. So what we are doing is that we are developing the ATO in such a way that the information can be used by different groups to track the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, as well as other regional transport-specific plans, such as the ESCAP Regional Action Plan and the ASEAN Kuala Lumpur Strategic Action Plan. And then there is another, the Environmental Sustainable Transport Declaration on Sustainable Transport. So, and then obviously, if this information is useful for the Asian Development Bank, it would also be useful for organizations like GIZ, World Bank, JICA, etc. And then last but not least, we see that in order to improve the transport sector research in the Asia-Pacific region, like our view is that if we can have a common pool of data, then that could lead to a strong qualitative improvement of transport research in Asia. Next slide. So what are we looking at? We are currently looking at 51 countries and regions, of which 49 are ADB member countries. And in addition to that, we are looking at Russia and Iran as well. With that, we are covering 40% of GDP, 55% of the global population, and 26% of the global land area. So it will be quite a comprehensive effort. Next. So what kind of information are we looking at? So we are looking at a number of main categories. First of all, we are looking at the transport infrastructure. What is the infrastructure which is currently in place, both in terms of rural transport, in terms of urban transport, and in terms of national transport? So that means that we are looking at what are the road networks, what are the, let's say, the rail networks, what are the inland water networks, and the aviation networks. Then we are looking in detail at the transport activity and services. And you could say that this is almost the holy grail of transport research. If we know what the vehicle park is, if we know the composition of public transport fleets, if we know how much people are moving, then we are actually able to say a lot about access. We're able to say a lot about associated emissions. So the infrastructure and the activities and services are, you could say, let's say, really at the heart of the Asian transport outlook. In addition to that, we are also looking at issues like road safety, climate change, air pollution, and things like that. But we feel that by really having a focus on the infrastructure and the activity and services, that we are also enabling and empowering other communities to do their detailed research on air pollution or on climate change. It is clear that there are some weaknesses in the current available data. Like if we talk about infrastructure, it's difficult to get detailed information about walking and cycling infrastructure. I think that Mirko indicated the issue of access. If you talk about urban access, it's relatively easy to determine what is the access to a metro or to a rail-based station, or in some cases a bus station, but it's much more difficult to find out what is the access to informal transport. And if we look at, for example, the metropolitan regions covered by the summer project, a large amount of the urban transport, of the public transport, is through informal transport. Rural transport is much less well documented than urban transport. We are also looking at the economic importance of the transport sector. And then one of the biggest challenges is to get reliable data on the informal transport sector. We all say that it's important to strengthen and improve the transport infrastructure, but we know relatively little about asset management. What is the quality? Let's say, what is the maintenance? So these are things that we need to look at. And then lastly, gender disaggregation, and you could say to some extent also data on a per income group basis. Like if we look at the previous presentation, and then we say There are so many people who have access to transport within 1 kilometer. Like, how does this work for different income groups? How does this work for different genders? So these are things that we are aware that in developing the ATO, that there are certain areas which need specific attention, because these are areas of weakness. At the moment, we are working on a national level database. However, in the background, we are already working on the development of an urban database as well. And the urban database will be structured largely in the same manner as the national level database. And the idea is that let's say by next year, that we would have a first version of this urban database, which would cover all the cities in Asia over 500,000 people. So this would be a database with about 400 plus cities. Within the ATO, we are looking at the past. We are looking at historic data. And by understanding the causal relationships and the connections and the correlations between this historic data, we also feel that we are in a better position to come up with detailed policy-based projections for the future as well. So, and that is related to the outlook part. Next slide. A nice example of different data that you come across then is, in this case for the Philippines, is that if we look at the official statistics for the Philippines, on the right-hand side, it says that there are 32,000 kilometers of roads. But if we look at all of the secondary sources, including OpenStreetMap, we come actually with numbers which are in some cases 6 times as high. So this is one of the things that we think is important. Like, if you talk about open data, you're talking about combining different data sources, and you're actually giving this information to the users with a word of caution, and that you say, please be aware what kind of source you are looking at and what kind of source you're going to use, and understand what kind of definitions have been used in developing the data. Next. In addition to the traditional transport data that we say, like, if we want to understand the transport sector in Asia, it is important as well to map the policies, the policy side of transport. And we are doing that on the basis of various transport subsectors like roads, rail, urban, water, air, and freight. And for these kinds of things, we will look at how are the institutional frameworks set up, what are the actual policies and associated targets, and what is the funding which is in place for developing the infrastructure and the maintenance. And likewise, we will be doing this for road safety, air pollution, and climate change as well. Next slide. Yeah, click many times. Keep clicking, keep clicking, keep clicking. So this is, you could say, one more. Keep clicking, Conrad. So this is, you could say, is the, let's say, the institutional or the context and network for the project, how it all fits together. And I think in a way, this covers all of the previous elements that I mentioned. Next slide. So how do we ensure the open data character of the ATO? First of all, we are going to integrate secondary and primary data from a wide range of sources, including various big data sources that are in the public domain. And I think that the example given by Mirko on how do you track access to public transport is a very good one. Like, coming back to what John was saying in his first presentation, it is important that you actually collect the right things and that you make it available in the right manner. And this is why, let's say, we are talking about communities of interest, in which we are going to integrate expert communities in setting the scope, determining the indicators and the subsequent analysis. And you could also say, how do you make it available? We will be transparent in pointing out data gaps and data inconsistencies between sources. And I think that there was the example that I mentioned for the Philippines is quite is a good example. And then we will make available all raw data as they become available to all that are interested. So in many cases, when people do data work, they say we first need to collect the data, then we need to analyze the data, and then we will make available the analysis. And in some cases, people make available the raw data as well. In our case, we say that the main output of the ATO is what we call is a shareable database, which contains all the raw data in a structured manner. And so we are happy that probably by December 11th, that we will be releasing the first batch of the information, which will include between 100 and 200 indicators divided over these various categories that I mentioned at the beginning. Then through this step 1 to 4, like that you can see on this slide, we expect to install a process of incremental improvement in data availability and quality. So then the last slide. I think at the bottom, I think I liked what John was saying is start with starting. My variation on this is the best way to keep going is to keep going. And then what is important as well is that data that sit unused are no different from data that were never collected in the first place. Just the fact that data is there does not necessarily mean that everything needs to be included. With that, I would like to hand back to Kat. Thank you.
The summer team would like to thank you for watching the Open Data webinar session. We had 4 sessions in total, introducing open data, discussing open data best practice around the world, and specifically in ASEAN, and also a session on how to make open data work. Throughout the month of November, we brought together a wide range of industry experts. Please see the other webinar sessions online. Thank you very much.